The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above the tiled ceiling of Consolidated Trust Bank, casting a sterile glow over the late afternoon crowd. Outside, the golden haze of a descending sun brushed the city in calm, but inside, a quiet storm was about to stir. No one noticed the man when he first walked in, stoic, steady, dressed in a plain tan coat and worn boots that had known more battlefields than boardrooms. His name was Colonel Richard Hale, retired. A name once barked through radios in foreign deserts, now spoken rarely, quietly, mostly by debt notices and lonely memories. He stood in line like everyone else, a faded leather folder tucked beneath his arm. His posture, straight and unwavering, bore no trace of age except for the subtle tremble in his knuckles and the silver at his temples. He didn't glance at the line ahead or check his phone. He simply waited. For years he had waited, for recognition, for peace, and now for a government-issued treasury check that had taken 7 years, for phone calls and 2 appeals to finally arrive. It wasn't much. Just enough to repair the collapsed roof that leaked into his kitchen, and perhaps, if any remained, a ticket to see his daughter and grandchildren, whom he hadn't hugged since before the pandemic. But to him, it wasn't about the money. It was about acknowledgement. A silent nation saying, "We remember you." When his turn came, he stepped forward to the counter. The teller, a young woman in a pristine blazer, barely glanced up from her monitor. Emily Tran, her name tag read, though the warmth in it was absent from her eyes. "I'd like to deposit this," Richard said, voice soft but composed. He unfolded the envelope and slid the check across the counter with a certain reverence, as if handing over something sacred. Emily picked it up and frowned almost instantly. "This doesn't look right," she said, her tone clipped. "Where did you get this?" "It's a treasury check," Richard replied, reaching for his wallet. "From the Department of Veterans Affairs. My name's on it, and here's my ID." But Emily's suspicion didn't waver. Her fingers moved swiftly across the keyboard, her eyes flicking back and forth between the check and the screen. Without a word, she lifted a UV scanner, passed it over the check, then hesitated. Richard noticed it, that hesitation, that small tightening around her mouth. His pulse quickened. "What's the problem?" he asked, more calmly than he felt. Emily leaned in, almost triumphantly. "It's policy. Suspicious checks must be destroyed." Before he could respond, before the air between them could be filled with reason or plea, her hand moved. The shredder beside her hummed awake with a mechanical growl. And then, in a flash of motion as swift as it was senseless, she fed the check into its teeth. The sound was deafening. To others, it was the mundane whir of a machine doing its job. But to Richard, it was the sound of years being erased, of dignity reduced to confetti, spit out onto a tray like trash. He stood motionless, stunned, as if someone had slapped him in public. "I followed protocol," Emily said flatly, offering no eye contact, no apology, just a wall of indifference. His mouth opened, but for a moment no words came. His hands, once steady even under gunfire, now trembled. "That check," he finally whispered, "was my lifeline." No one moved. No one spoke. Around them, the room froze. Conversations halted, whispers rising like distant wind. A few heads turned. A woman by the deposit forms covered her mouth. Someone raised a phone discreetly, recording. But the damage had been done. A man who had once commanded battalions had just been dismissed like a fraudster, treated like a threat. And all he had done was believe the system would honor its promise. He stepped back slowly, swallowing the sting of humiliation. He looked down at the ID still in his hand, the one that had once opened gates at secured bases, now ignored at a civilian counter. Then he looked up, not at Emily but beyond her, past the teller glass, past the walls, past the protocol. And something inside him shifted. A silence deeper than defeat. A quiet refusal to let this be the end. He walked out into the fading light, not broken, but sparked. Because some battles don't begin with gunfire. Some begin with the sound of a shredder. Outside, the wind had picked up, rustling the faded American flag above the bank's entrance as Colonel Richard Hale sat motionless on a bench nearby. The metal felt cold beneath him, but it wasn't the bench that made him shiver. It was the weight of what had just happened. He stared at his hands, still trembling slightly. Not from fear. From insult. From the hollow echo of a machine chewing through something more than paper. His service, his history, his worth. He could still hear it. The low mechanical growl. He could still see the indifference in that teller's eyes. The calm way she had destroyed what he'd fought years to earn. The check might have been only paper to her, but to him, it was blood. It was the silence of nights on foreign soil. The ache in knees that hadn't bent right since Fallujah. The echo of friends who never came home. For a moment, he considered walking away, taking the memory like another scar and adding it to the list. But something in him resisted. A voice, deep and old, whispering, "You don't back down from dishonor." His fingers reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a weathered phone. The screen lit up, cracked faintly at the edge. He scrolled until he found the name. James Harlan, Treasury Office. A contact not used in years, forged in trust long ago, back when they were both younger, both in the thick of things. He hesitated for half a breath, then tapped call. It rang once. Office of the Undersecretary for Domestic Finance. A calm voice answered. "This is Colonel Richard Hale," he said, his voice low, steel coiled beneath. "I need to speak with Undersecretary Harlan. Immediately." There was a pause on the line, brief but telling. Then a click. "Richard?" came a voice, older, familiar, laced with concern. "What's going on?" And then the dam broke. Richard recounted every detail, the check, the teller, the shredder, the refusal to verify, the look of institutional coldness on a girl's face who had known war, but somehow held the power to erase a veteran's dignity in seconds. He spoke not with anger, but with precision, the kind of voice commanders use in chaos. Every detail placed like a charge. On the other end, James Harlan listened. The silence was heavy, not from inaction, but from restrained fury. "She shredded it?" James repeated finally, his voice low and sharp as a drawn blade. "Yes." "That's not just negligence," he said slowly. "That's a federal violation. A government instrument. She destroyed a treasury asset. We're not talking about rudeness, Richard. That's a felony." "I haven't left," Richard replied simply. "I'm still here, sitting outside. I wanted to give the system a chance to correct itself." James exhaled hard. "Good. Don't move. You're about to see just how loud a veteran's silence can roar." The call ended. Richard looked out at the traffic moving quietly down the street. Families, students, workers. None of them knew what had just ignited beneath the surface of their quiet city. But he knew. And then, less than 15 minutes later, it began. 2 black sedans glided to a halt in front of the bank, polished and dark like vultures in the sun. The doors opened in practiced unison, and men and women in sharp suits stepped out, their steps fast, direct, without hesitation. They didn't pause for greetings or explanations. Their badges caught the light, flashing authority. Inside the bank, Emily Tran was mid-conversation with her manager, unaware. The agents moved in silence until they stood directly before her counter. "Miss Tran." "Mr. Walker," one said. "I'm Special Agent Dana Ruiz, Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. This is Special Agent Kendrick from the Treasury Inspector General's office. You will come with us." Gasps spread like wind through the bank lobby. Phones tilted upward. Voices hushed. The once sterile quiet was now charged, electric, almost cinematic. Justice, it seemed, had arrived wearing suits and walking fast. Outside, Richard didn't smile. He didn't move. He just watched. Not with vengeance, but with clarity. Because sometimes the system only remembers its conscience when someone bleeds on its doorstep. This wasn't about revenge. It was about memory, about accountability, about refusing to let silence become surrender. And all it took was one phone call, one man refusing to disappear, and a nation that, when prodded hard enough, still knew how to stand at attention. Inside the bank, the air had shifted. It wasn't just the agents in dark suits that changed the atmosphere. It was the weight they carried. It was the sudden, unmistakable presence of justice walking in with federal credentials and eyes that had seen too much to be swayed by rehearsed excuses. Emily Tran, the teller whose mechanical obedience had just shredded a veteran's dignity, stood frozen. Her mouth parted slightly, as if mid-sentence, but no sound came. Her manager, David Walker, stiffened beside her, his polished calm cracking under the sudden heat of scrutiny. Behind them, the rest of the bank fell into a stunned hush. Customers stood as witnesses now, not to a transaction, but to a reckoning. Special Agent Dana Ruiz didn't raise her voice.
She didn't need to.
Authority, real authority, speaks softly and cuts deep. We're here to investigate a potential violation of federal law regarding the mishandling of a U.S. Treasury instrument, she said. Her tone was cool, professional, but underneath it, there was iron. We understand a government-issued disability check, lawful and verified, was destroyed on these premises without due process. Emily swallowed. Her hands, which had hovered over the shredder's button with such certainty an hour ago, now clutched each other as if seeking absolution. I followed protocol, she said, though the words came out brittle. No, Agent Ruiz replied. You didn't. You skipped critical verification steps required for any government-issued instrument. And you acted on personal suspicion, not legal procedure. That's not protocol. That's misconduct. Mr. Walker tried to step in, voice slick with corporate polish. She was just trying to protect the bank from fraud. We train our employees to be cautious. Ruiz cut him off without looking away from Emily. Being cautious does not mean violating federal code. It does not mean assuming fraud based on paper stock and gut feeling. And it certainly does not mean shredding a veteran's compensation without even a phone call to verify its authenticity. She turned now, locking eyes with Walker. Your training program, your oversight, your culture of discretionary suspicion, those are not shields. They are liabilities. You will be held accountable. Outside the office windows, the street looked the same. Cars passed. A mother pushed a stroller across the intersection. But inside this sterile, fluorescent-lit bank, something had cracked open, the illusion that institutions could run on automatic, unchecked, and unchallenged. Agents moved swiftly now, confiscating logs, retrieving internal emails, auditing scanner records. Cameras were reviewed. Calls were traced. Every tiny act of negligence left a footprint, and they followed each one. Piece by piece, the paper trail that had led to a man's humiliation was now being reassembled into evidence. Meanwhile, Colonel Richard Hale remained outside, watching from the bench, posture straight as a flagpole, eyes steady. He didn't need to be inside to know what was happening. He'd seen this kind of operation before, years ago in different colors under different flags. The difference was this time, the war wasn't overseas. It was right here on home soil, and the weapons were law, truth, and accountability. Then his phone buzzed. It was James Harlan again. Richard, he said. The audit's in full swing. Your replacement check is already in your account. Electronic and verified. You should see it by the hour's end. Richard closed his eyes, letting that sink in. We're waiving every fee, and the bank's leadership is being reviewed from the top down. Emily Tran has been suspended pending disciplinary action. The branch manager, too. Internal policy will be rewritten after this. Trust me, we're not just fixing this. We're gutting the rot. For a moment, Richard said nothing. Then, that's more than I expected. No, Colonel, Harlan replied. It's the bare minimum you deserve. You served this country with honor. The system should have honored you back. Today it failed. But now it remembers who it owes. Richard exhaled slowly, the pressure in his chest easing. But it wasn't satisfaction he felt. Not quite. It was something deeper. The quiet sense that something sacred had been restored. Not by violence. Not by protest. But by principle. By holding the line when it mattered most. He stood. Inside the bank, Emily was escorted out. Not in handcuffs, but in consequence. Her shoulders slumped, eyes vacant. Mr. Walker followed, pale and shaken. The agents didn't gloat. They didn't need to. Justice doesn't scream. It signs forms and files reports and rewrites protocols. And somewhere between page 12 of a Treasury compliance manual and the quiet determination of a retired soldier who wouldn't walk away, honor had been defended, not with a rifle, but with law. In the end, that was what made the system worth saving. And for the first time in hours, Richard Hale felt like a citizen again. Not forgotten.
Not dismissed. Seen.
The next morning, sunlight poured over the small town like quiet redemption, gilding the tops of buildings, brushing gently across the sidewalk where Colonel Richard Hale walked with the steady calm of a man who had seen storms and waited them out. The American flag above the bank fluttered again, but today, it no longer looked like a hollow symbol waving over a place that had once erased him. Today, it looked like what it was meant to be, a vow. And somewhere inside that building, policies were being rewritten, computers reprogrammed, trainings restructured. The sterile indifference of yesterday had been pierced because one man refused to let silence speak for him. He wasn't a hero. Not anymore. Heroes had statues and medals. Richard Hale had neither. What he had was memory and a spine that had never learned how to bend. At the bank's entrance, a new poster had been taped to the glass. We honor our veterans, with action, not just words. Below it, a list of changes. Immediate verification hotline for veteran-issued instruments. Special desk for senior and disabled veterans. Zero-tolerance shredding policy for federal documents. It wasn't enough to erase what had happened, but it was more than words. It was correction. And it came not from guilt, but from accountability. Inside, he wasn't met with the cool, suspicious glances of yesterday. The new branch manager, a woman in her 40s with eyes that looked like she'd read the full report, stepped forward as he entered. No PR smile. No script. Just quiet sincerity. "Colonel Hale," she said, "I'm truly sorry for what happened here. I've read everything. And I've met with every staff member personally. This bank is no longer the same place it was 2 days ago." He nodded once. No ceremony. Just truth. "I didn't ask for an apology," he said gently. "I asked for change. Looks like I got both." "Would you allow me to shake your hand?" she asked, voice low. He extended his hand. And in that simple gesture, something unseen passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not even approval. But recognition. The kind that speaks between citizens, between people who remember that institutions don't define a nation. People do. Later that day, he stopped by the local diner. People he didn't know nodded at him. A young man in his 20s, tattoos, earbuds, hands stained from a mechanic shop, stood awkwardly by his table. "Sir," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "My dad, he was a Marine.
I saw what happened to you.
Just wanted to say thank you for not staying quiet." Richard looked at him for a long moment. "That's exactly why I didn't." And that was the quiet truth. Not for himself, but for the others. The ones who came after. The ones who didn't have a James Harlan to call. The ones who would be turned away without ever knowing they had been wronged. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the grain silos, he stood on the small porch of his home. The check, reissued, validated, honored, sat unopened on his table. He'd already donated it to a veterans support group. What mattered had never been the money. It had been the principle.
The test.
And whether the country he once bled for could still remember the meaning of the oath it had sworn. The phone rang again. This time it wasn't Harlan. It was someone from the governor's office, an invitation to speak at a ceremony on public accountability and veteran recognition. He declined politely. "This isn't about me," he said. "This is about remembering who we owe and acting like we mean it." He hung up and looked out into the dusk. Justice, he realized, doesn't always arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes, it comes in paper rewrites and policy shifts, in quiet nods, in the way a bank reopens with new training manuals, in the way a young man stands straighter because someone else refused to bow. Trust isn't given. It's built, and sometimes rebuilt. And in that small American town, in that quiet corner of bureaucracy and bone-deep memory, justice had not only returned. It had remembered how to stand. There are men who disappear quietly into the folds of time. And then there are men like Colonel Richard Hale, who, even in silence, leave behind a pressure in the air that lingers long after they've passed. Weeks had gone by since the incident at the bank. The world, as always, had moved on, faster, noisier, and just as indifferent. But not everyone forgot. Not everyone could. At Consolidated Trust Bank, the agents were long gone, the headlines had cooled, and the posters had faded from the windows. A fresh coat of paint dulled the memory. But deep inside the protocols of the bank's operations, somewhere in the cold machinery of policy and digital infrastructure, his name still pulsed. Colonel Richard Hale. Case number 416B. Precedent established. Mandatory review. He had become a clause. A line of red text in corporate compliance documents. A case study in every new hire's onboarding slideshow. When in doubt, verify. Never assume. And always respect those who served. He would never know just how many layers of bureaucracy had been forced to blink because of him. How many internal emails bore his name, how many risk officers used his case as the reason for tighter oversight. But that wasn't the kind of legacy he sought. He didn't ask to be a symbol. He became one because he held the line where no one else would. On his daily walks through town, nothing changed in how he carried himself. The same coat, the same gait, the same nod of acknowledgement to those who met his eye. But now, people saw him differently. Not out of pity, but out of a sharper understanding. That behind his weathered hands and measured silence was a man who had once stared down death abroad, then came home and stared down indifference with equal resolve. A young girl at the library once stopped him. "You're the man from the video," she said. "The one who made the government come." He smiled gently. "I just reminded it to wake up." And that, perhaps, was the true legacy. That in a world ruled by cold systems and indifferent forms, there could still be a quiet pressure, a silent weight, shaped like a man who refused to be erased. He didn't need monuments. He didn't need speeches. His monument was the moment someone, somewhere, hesitated before saying no to a veteran. His tribute was the pause in a teller's hand before they reached for the shredder. His medal was the change in a policy manual that now began with the words, "Respect is not optional." In the end, Richard Hale remained what he had always been, a keeper of lines. Lines of duty, lines of honor, lines that systems forget but memory restores. And while the systems moved forward, cold, corrected, but still distant, he stayed.
Solid.
Unshaken. A quiet symbol, not in stone or bronze, but in the marrow of a town that would never be quite the same again. Because some battles are never televised. Some victories are never paraded. But they matter. They ripple. And sometimes they begin with a single voice saying, "This isn't over."